Coming up next is the Dr. Kim Taylor Show. Here's your chance to talk about what matters to you. Although you'll receive helpful advice from Dr. Kim, remember this is not to be construed as any form of psychotherapy, diagnosis or treatment, and cannot replace a therapeutic relationship with a mental health professional. You can reach Dr. Kim by calling 564-1290 or 866-564-1290. You can also listen live on the internet at drkimtaylorshow.com. Now, here's Dr. Kim.
Are you a helicopter parent? It's a term given to these obsessively protective parents who hover around their kids and try to micromanage their lives. But what happens is the kids can tend to end up becoming helpless teenagers and adults who always look for others to swoop in and save them. We're talking about parenting today, and we're really looking into the question, how can we raise our children to be happy, healthy, and successful adults? It's true that through the generations, there have been many different kinds of ways to parent, and what constitutes the best way to raise our children has really swung from being under-involved to over-involved with all of these parenting styles. But really what remains constant is a parent's wish for their child to be happy and successful, and then to try as best we can to protect them from any negative consequences. But do we really help our children by being overprotective? Or do we hinder them from developing some necessary skills on their own in our rush to make them comfortable and ourselves less anxious? So while our intentions may be good, where do we cross the line and in fact start to impede the development of self-confidence and resilience necessary for successful 21st century living? We have research that shows us that parents who are involved in their children's lives contribute to their well-being and success, and they do that on an emotional level, they do it socially and academically. But we also find that parents who are too involved, too controlling, and micromanaging their children's lives can have just the opposite effect. So today my guest is Julie Lett. She's the author of How to Raise an Adult. She is a mother herself, and she served as Dean of Freshmen and Undergraduate Advising at Stanford University. So we're going to explore how overparenting may not only hamper the development of your child, but also have far-reaching effects to our society as a whole. So if you have a question, please join us. Give me a call at 805-564-1290, or you can email me your questions at drkim@drkimtaylorshow.com. So I'll be right back with my guests after this short break. I'm Kim Taylor. This is the Dr. Kim Taylor Show.
You are listening to Dr. Kim Taylor on KZSB AM 1290.
How can parents break free from the trap of overparenting and still prepare their kids for success? My guest today is Julie Lett, and she has served as Dean of Freshmen and Undergraduate Advising for over a decade at Stanford University, where she received the Dinkelspiel Award for her contributions to the undergraduate experience. She's also a mother of 2 teenagers, and she has spoken and written widely on the phenomena of helicopter parenting. And her work has appeared on TEDx Talks and in Forbes and the Chicago Tribune. Her book is How to Raise an Adult: Break Free of the Overparenting Trap and Prepare Your Kid for Success. Welcome to the program, Julie.
Dr. Kim, thank you so much for having me.
So are parents too over-involved in the lives of their children today?
Well, I think we all know the answer to that question. The answer is yes. The far more complicated question is really what to do about it. And I think, essentially what's happened is we've become too overprotective, overdirective, meaning we want to tell our kids exactly what to do in order to be successful. And we handhold them too much. We act as their concierge or their personal assistant. And we're doing all this in furtherance of wanting their success and fueled by love and fear, but we've lost sight of the fact that if you think about it, our long-term job as parents, our obligation biologically is to put ourselves out of a job and raise our kids, our offspring, to a place of independent adulthood so that, they can fend for themselves and maybe even raise their own kids one day.
So what are the ways that you can really let people know that it is overprotecting or overdirecting or handholding with their kids? What is it specifically that you are thinking about when you say that?
Well, I think the overprotection mindset is it's a scary, unsafe, unpredictable world, and therefore I must try to prevent my kid from experiencing it or protect them from experiencing it. Whereas the healthier, more empowering, more skills-building approach is to prepare kids for whatever, we see out there as being unpredictable or scary. The overdirecting mindset is the sense that I know best what will lead to your success, and you will study these topics and get these grades and go to these schools and colleges and pursue these careers and professions, because we think we know best, and we've decided that whatever our kid might want for themselves is really less important than what we have in mind. And then the hand-holding type is the parent that wants to fill out the forms and keep track of the deadlines, and if there's a problem, to take that problem up with the teacher or the principal or the coach or the referee. They're trying to smooth the path for their kid. In all three instances, again, fueled by love and fueled by fear, we end up doing too much for our kids, and they end up underprepared out in the world of work or the world of college or university, essentially because they haven't done enough of the living of life, the thinking of things through on their own, the being and doing for themselves. We're essentially depriving them in an existential sense of the opportunity to become their own actual selves.
So when we are doing things for our kids that they could and should be doing for themselves, we are sending them that negative message that here, I'm going to jump in, I'm going to do this for you because I don't really believe that you can do this on your own.
Right.
And it undermines their self-esteem.
Exactly. Okay. How many of us would ever set out to send our kids that incredibly insidious message? None of us. None of us wants to have been told that we're not capable, and we certainly don't want to be telling our kids that message. But this is the unintended consequence of our overhelp that bores into their developing minds and brains and hearts and souls. It's that sense that, hey, kid, you're not actually capable without me. We act as if we'll always be here to protect and direct and handhold them. But if things work out the way they should biologically, we predecease them, not the other way around. That means we won't always be here. And at some point, they have to be capable of making decisions, solving problems, contending with different options and opportunities, soothing their own hurt feelings. They've got to have that capacity. We should want that for them instead of feeling that somehow it's more loving or more helpful to always be doing for them.
You say that this is driven by both love and fear. And of course we get the love part because we do love our kids. We want what's best for them. We want them to have what's best. We don't want them to get hurt. But speak to us a little bit more about the fear behind this overprotectiveness and this being so over-involved and or scooping in and rescuing them so that they don't have to get frustrated. What is that, and how can parents really start to really look at that within themselves?
Dr. Kim, I think that's a great question, and what I'm going to do is kind of pull back to the origins of how this whole overparenting phenomenon began, because I think it ends up illuminating what the fears are. In the early to mid-1980s, there were 4 things that were happening all at once in our nation that really gave birth to the overparenting phenomenon. The first was our sense of stranger danger was born. There were a couple of horrific well-publicized cases of child abduction in the United States in the early 80s, one of which led to the movie, the made-for-TV movie Adam.
Adam Walsh,
yeah.
Yes.
And that movie was seen by, that TV show was seen by more people than any other show except the Who Shot JR episode of Dallas, for those of us old enough to remember that. The point is, it was shown in a time when there were far fewer entertainment choices on television, no internet. Many, many millions of people watched that show. our fear of strangers lurking in every park, every schoolyard, every sidewalk, around every corner, though not borne out by statistics then or now, that fear was really born then, the sense that we need to keep our children by our side. The second thing happening at the exact same time was the birth of the self-esteem movement right here in California. It became part of our statewide, curriculum, and then, of course, infiltrated the rest of the nation. This is the sense that, hey, we got to applaud kids just for showing up. Everyone gets a trophy. I'd say the only people who really benefited from that approach, as we now know 30 years later, are the ribbon and trophy and certificate makers, who made billions probably off of our need to praise children at every turn. But we thought it fostered self-esteem. Instead, it actually fostered a sense of entitlement, that they should be applauded or recognized for every little thing, instead of teaching our kids, what real achievement and accomplishment actually is. The third thing is the play date was born in 1984. That's the first use on record. Moms were going back to work. Dads weren't exactly staying home. Who was going to be there when kids needed to play or needed to get from one house to the other? So parents began scheduling play, which was probably rather innocent, but then it turned into watching out as the kids played and hovering and deciding what they should play and intervening if they weren't getting along and taking turns. The fourth thing was A Nation at Risk was published, and this said that American teenagers weren't doing as well academically as against their international peers, and we needed more testing and to teach to the test. So if you take these things in the aggregate, our fear of what could happen out on sidewalks and in parks and street corners, our sense of needing to, praise them at every turn and really soothe their feelings and, promote their self-esteem, our need to hover over their play, which used to be the unique realm of children, and our need to ensure that they were testing well and, getting that homework accomplished. These things all born from, a fear that they wouldn't be okay, wouldn't survive, wouldn't succeed. This confluence of things happening in the early 80s led to this overparenting, which is now a way of life in so many communities.
And there are a lot of these things that really are very fear-based behaviors, the fear of the danger. So explain the difference between, because I think this is very funny, just as I think about how I grew up versus how I was being kind of fear-based, that my behavior was in raising my own child. So try to explain what it was like to be a baby boomer versus what baby boomers' children's life. So kind of the day in the life of each. What would it look like for a baby boomer, and what would it look like for a baby boomer's child these days?
Well, it's great that you've homed in on baby boomers because, of course, they were the ones who adopted this parenting style in the early 1980s, really quite ironically demanded their own voice, their own freedoms, their own independence, their own right to think and do for themselves as teenagers and young adults, changing some of the major paradigms in American society when they were young. Now they're stepping in and really trying to hover over their own kids' lives and encroach upon their own kids' lives in ways I think they simply would not have tolerated had their own parents tried to do the same thing. So a baby boomer's life, and I'm Gen X, so I'll add, as I was growing up in the 70s and early 80s, a Gen Xer's life was blissfully free of the hovering of parents. Very often we came home from school, dropped our bag of homework, at the door. It was probably a fraction of the size of today's kids', volume of homework or the size of the backpack. We went out and played. Our parents, typically our moms, would say, go out and play, I'll call you in for dinner. They would yell, they would open the door and yell, Julie.
Or mine was a cowbell. So.
Okay, I was just going to say that. In some places it was a bell. I mean, if you're a millennial listening to the Dr. Kim show right now, you're thinking this is absurd. It sounds like fiction. It sounds like the 1890s. No, we're talking about as recently as the early 1980s, where kids had time in their lives to play. They played with other kids. They knew where other kids were because the bikes were piled up outside, on the grass or in the driveway. We went places on our own, biked places on our own. And the volume of homework was much less. The number of organized activities were far fewer. So we just had more time to just be. And it was a glorious childhood. I think some would call it benign neglect because our parents didn't know where we were at all times. Let's face it just wasn't possible. This gets to a really important point for today. Just because we can know where our kids are at all times, tracking them by GPS if we want to, doesn't mean we necessarily should, because there ends up being this very penned-in sense of childhood today. in contrast to the way the baby boomers and the Gen Xers live. So today, a kid leads what I call the checklisted childhood. A set of, you go to school and you have homework, you're in the right classes, we expect a certain set of grades from you from those classes and your academic performance accordingly throughout the week. But also on top of that, we're going to expect you to be involved in activities, sports, extracurriculars, drama, music, dance, whatever it is. And on top of that, we want you to do community service. And on top of that, leadership. And on top of that, we might provide you with extra coaching or enrichment, to improve you in some manner where you're not perfect. A kid's life is scheduled to the hilt. They barely have time to sleep, and they're certainly not doing anywhere near the amount of chores that kids did years ago. Why does that matter? Because chores build a sense of work ethic that is directly proportional to the amount of success a human will achieve in the world of work one day, according to the Harvard Grant study, which is one of the longest studies of humans ever conducted over many, many decades. Chores equals professional success. The earlier you start, the better. So, our kids are way too busy for the work of life. We handle it all for them. In furtherance of them building their perfect resume and transcript. Childhood today, here's another way in which the boomer childhood is different than today's. Childhood today, you're expected to emerge from it with a resume, which is, in my view, absurd and sad. There's no time for them to daydream, and that really undercuts the development of a sense of self.
So what you're saying is that this very involved style of parenting, it does offer short-term gains in the form that parents feel like the kids are safer. It does offer the opportunities to give their kids all of these different things that they might not choose on their own. And maybe perhaps it helps to secure the outcomes or what they hope will happen or the school that they hope their kid will get into. So on one hand, it does work short term to relieve some anxiety and fear. But what are the long-term effects that we're talking about the dangers of overparenting?
Well, you're absolutely right about the short-term wins. I mean, who doesn't somehow achieve a little bit more or feel a little bit safer if they've got a, more experienced, better educated adult or two on either side of them? The long-term harm is this. Number one, they lack life skills. If mom or dad have always been there to handle the deadlines or to give them directions or tell them, what to pursue, or clean up after them, or bring their homework when they forget it, or always make them food, they actually end up as young adults who don't have those skills. And, it's kind of darling if you're 8 and you don't know how to, make yourself a snack. But if you're 18 or you're 20 or you're 22 and you have a thick resume, but you don't know how to really take care of a household or be responsible for your own belongings or deadlines, they're bewildered, and rightly so, but no one feels sorry for them. They just think, what's wrong with you? So there's a lack of life skills. Second, there's a lack of capacities needed in the workplace. If childhood has been lived according to a checklist, they've always been told what to do, and all they had to do is be really excellent at what their parents told them to do. They get to the world of work where there is no longer a checklist, and they're bewildered. Again, they want to be told what to do. They don't know. If you give them a problem to solve in a work setting, if there aren't clear steps, and they've been raised according to this checklisted childhood, they simply don't have the wherewithal to, imagine possibilities and think creatively and think outside the box. The third example, or the third outcome, if you will, of overparenting in the long term is sharp increases in the rates of anxiety and depression. And this comes directly from not having had the chance to think and be and do and figure things out for themselves. They've essentially been deprived of the chance to construct a healthy self. And so they are sort of bewildered in a psychological sense. They are they're less familiar with their own selves. They're less familiar with how the world works. They're so accustomed to being told what to do and how to do it, they end up with higher rates of depression and anxiety. So, sometimes parents say, look, but I want my kid to get into that really, great university or college, and we should get to whether those universities and colleges are the only ones that are great. But people know what I'm talking about. The ones on the top 10 or 20 list that U.S. News puts out, some parents joke, look, I'd rather my kid get into one of those places than because I've overhelped or been overinvolved or forced them, or, they've not been able to play or have fun, but they're going to get into that school. I'd rather that happen than not. They can always work out their psychological difficulties in their 20s. And my feeling is, hold up, folks. are we really going to play with our kids' mental health like that? I've got a 14-year-old and 16-year-old, and once upon a time, I wanted them to go to Stanford, which is where I went, and I met their dad there. Why would I want, quote-unquote, anything less was my mindset 10 years ago. Now I appreciate there are probably 100, 150 schools that are excellent in this country, most of which people haven't heard. I'm happy for my kid to go to a college where they feel a true sense of fit and belonging. They're going to be challenged, but also, valued there. And I want them to have their mental health intact. If my kids can come out of Palo Alto, California with their mental health intact, I'm going to consider that an example of good parenting.
Well, and I did a show a while back about kids who fail to launch, and all of what you're saying here is this is the exact reason why it's so hard, because when it's time for kids to go off to be on their own or to go to college, they are not prepared to be on their own without having a team behind them that is going to support them. So I'm here with my guest, Julie Lett Hames, and she's the author of How to Raise an Adult. I'm Dr. Kim. You're listening to Dr. Kim Taylor Show, and we'll be right back after this short break.
You are listening to Dr. Kim Taylor on KZSB AM 1290.
If you are just joining me, we are talking to my guest, Julie Lett Hames, about the helicopter parenting trend and how dangerous that this can be to our kids' self-esteem and their ability to become successful in the world. She is the author of How to Raise an Adult, as well as the former Dean of Freshman and Undergraduate Advising at Stanford. With all of your observations, Julie, and you're talking to whether it's teens or their parents or the educators or counselors or even employers, what were some of the issues that you found with the freshmen who were coming into college and being away from their parents for the very first time?
Well, the first thing we noticed, this was in the late 90s at Stanford, we noticed parents were no longer just dropping their son or daughter off or waving goodbye to them at a bus station or airport. They were coming to campus and staying, usually not literally, sometimes literally, but virtually quite involved. They expected to play a role in the life of the university, to ask questions, research information and opportunities, get involved if there was a dispute or a misunderstanding or an opportunity that their son or daughter didn't end up winning for themselves. So, it was odd in the late 90s. We sort of laughed and giggled about it because it seemed so silly, because parents hadn't previously been so involved on a college campus. And then their numbers grew every year and grew. And at the same time, students seemed like they were still scanning the sidelines for mom or dad to help them, which, again, was odd to see in 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds or 22-year-olds. And, I began to put two and two together when I was giving a talk to parents of Stanford freshmen at orientation one year, 2009, I believe it was. My own kids were 8 and 10, and I was trying to tell the Stanford parents, you can leave. Trust your kid, number one. Number two, trust the university. Number three, now go home. Let your son or daughter have this college experience. I came home to my own house the next day for dinner, leaned over and started cutting my 10-year-old son's meat, and I realized, oh, my goodness, I'm on track to be one of those parents who can't just magically let go when they turn 18 and head off to college or the workplace, because I've been overhelping along the way. I realized then that the skills that a kid needs don't just magically land, they don't just magically acquire those skills on their 18th birthday.
Right.
Childhood is meant to prepare them. So, I had students, just to get to your question about examples, I had students who, a student who had a set of boxes arrive delivered by UPS, and, they were each big and needed two people to carry them, and he just was so unfamiliar with working with other humans, he didn't know how to ask for help. So the boxes sat outside for a day and a half until someone else who lived in the dorm, decided to marshal some help to get those boxes inside. This kid just didn't feel like he could approach someone else. That's a parenting fail. I heard of kids, we started calling college students kids, by the way, in the last 10 or 15 years. I heard of kids who didn't know how to pump gas. Their parents always, pumped their gas, filled their tanks in high school, did it in college whenever they came to visit, which was frequently. They end up trying to drive someplace at 21, 22 years of age, and they realize I've never, my gas tank is low and I've never had to pump my own gas. That seems silly and we can laugh at it. The harder things are, our students are so failure deprived, as my colleague Adina Glickman put it at Stanford. They've never failed, they've never fallen, the path has been smooth. When they get a B- or a C or a D or an F, their life is over. It feels as if it is because, they hadn't had those smaller failures along the way.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, it was my grandfather who said to me one day, he said, Kimberly, we will know the measure of who you are when you fail.
Yeah.
And so he really welcomed that and thought that that was just what you needed to do to be able to be challenged and deal with the frustration and the upset with that, to really figure out who you are and figure out who you are separate from others and find your ability to be resilient or resourceful. And through all of that is where you gain your pride in self. It doesn't come from an outside source that tells you that you're a good person and it looks good on paper.
Well, your grandfather was a very, very wise man. And it sounds like his own ego wasn't wrapped up in your every outcome. And, of course, that's something that's really changed. We tend to think of our kids today as being our masterpiece. Their accomplishments shine on us. Their failures, God forbid, tarnish us. And that's how many of us feel. And it's really, really messed up. Carl Jung said that we really get in our kids' way when, we essentially aren't living our own lives and are trying to, live our lives either vicariously or just through our intertwined, intense interests. We're trying to sort of, we make it as if their life is ours, and that's just really unhealthy.
Well, so let's talk about this, because the level of stress and anxiety, even for parents to keep this all up, especially if their kids are now the new measure of their own success, this is taking a toll on more and more parents as more and more parents are on anti-anxiety, antidepressants, just to deal with the added stress of trying to not only manage their own lives, but now micromanage their children's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to write this book because I care so much about young adults making their way. I care about all of us making our way in the world, not held back by other people or by life circumstances. That's what I've devoted my career to across various professions. Nowadays, we parents are wondering, when did childhood get so stressful? Why is this so hard? We're trying to keep up with the Joneses, as we always have. That phrase used to mean having the same type of house or car as our neighbor, but now it means having the right bumper sticker, depicting where our child attends college, on the back of our car, that bumper sticker that, that says, hey, we've succeeded, we've raised a kid who went to a really, prestigious school. It's impossible to keep up. We're in this arms race. It feels, our kids are in this race against other kids. We're competing against other parents. It's all gotten to be really too much, and I think many, many people listening to this, I'm imagining, are nodding their heads because we know it. And we're just wanting somebody to hit stop, hit the button that just stops the game and let us regroup. Let us just take a deep breath and start over. Let us focus on things like, family dinners and, laughing and joking and storytelling with our kids. Let's not be so obsessed about, their every goal, their every achievement, their every grade, their every test score. Let's just focus on having a happy family and trust that, if our kids are loved and have some manners and have a work ethic, they'll have a really great shot of making their way in the world, not necessarily doing what we would have them do, but it's not up to us to decide what they should do for a living or where they should go to college.
So this would mean that they really have to redefine what success means.
Absolutely. In too many communities, certainly up here in the Bay Area, and I know in many communities in LA and certainly across the nation, in a lot of places, we've defined success so narrowly. It's attend a certain prestigious school, or one of these 20 schools. It's a certain career, law, business, medicine, finance, engineering. It's a very narrow definition, and it doesn't fit most kids. The irony is many of us can think back, to our own upbringings where we might have had, a set of parental expectations about what we would become professionally. Our parents weren't hovering over our every day in childhood, but for many of us, our parents conditioned their love on, you will become a doctor, you will become a, whatever. Many of us have spent our adult lives getting out from under that encroachment our own parents made in terms of telling us what to do. Why are we perpetuating that with our own kids? Each kid's got to figure out what they're good at, what their talents are, what they love, and we've got to look for those cues and clues from our kid and then They provide that spark. We fan the flames. We're supporting them in being who they are. We're helping them become stronger and more capable at the things that matter to them instead of marching them down a particular path that we've made.
So let's go to just the basics. What are some alternatives to overparenting?
Well, if you'll accept that our job as parents is to put ourselves out of a job and raise our kids to independent adulthood, you then realize that childhood is meant to prepare the way. And what this means is there are skills and mindsets and habits and capabilities they're supposed to be learning. And in my book, How to Raise an Adult, I outline a number of things, the life skills that they've got to learn, from looking after themselves to making a simple meal to taking care of their clothes and dealing with garbage. But also, like I said, mindsets and habits about pitching in and doing hard work. Whatever the skill is, take, for example, crossing the street alone. A child goes from being carried in our arms to being an adult, presumably, who can, cross streets on his or her own. Well, how do you get there? There is a 4-step method that I actually learned from a woman who's raising a child with special needs, a friend of mine named Stacy Ashland, who did a lot of research on how do you teach skills to a kid with special needs. Turns out to apply to any kid, and particularly today with so many typically developing kids, meaning kids who don't have special needs, lacking in life skills. I turn to the special needs community for guidance on, well, how do you teach skills? And here are the 4 steps. Number 1, first you do it for them. Second, you do it with them. Third, you watch them do it. And fourth, they do it completely independently. So again, go back to that example of learning to cross the street. First, you do it for them. This means you're holding them in your arms. Next, you do it with them. They're standing next to you, holding your hand, but you're doing the looking left and right and left again. You're making the decision when it's safe, but you're sort of saying this out loud to your kid so they start to learn. The third step is that you do it with them. And this is where they're going to make the decision about when it's safe to cross. You might still be holding their hand or just walking alongside. And the fourth step is they can cross that street on their own. You don't even have to be there. That's just one example of how, one of an innumerable number of life skills can be taught to kids.
Okay, we are actually going to take a quick break. My guest is Julie Lett, and we're talking about how to stop overparenting. And I think we're going to come back and we're going to talk about some of the questions that you get from parents around the country and really to address some of those so that it gives people an idea about what they can do instead of what they have been doing and why it's so important, not only to themselves, but their child, but to society at large. I'm Dr. Kim, and you're listening to the Dr. Kim Taylor Show.
You are listening to Dr. Kim Taylor on KZSB AM 1290.
My guest for the hour is Julie Lett, and she's the author of How to Raise an Adult. And she's spoken widely of the importance of allowing our children to make their own mistakes in order for them to be able to develop the resilience and the resourcefulness and really an inner sense of being that they're going to need in order to be successful in the world today. So there are a lot of questions people ask, and I thought that we would get to those. And one of those is there are times when we really do need to help our children. So how do we know what's plain old helpful versus what is harmful and over-helping or over-involved?
Yeah, really good question. So here's where I defer to a wonderful expert, Madeline Levine, who many of your listeners will be familiar with. She's a psychologist up here in the Bay Area in Marin County, wrote The Price of Privilege and Teach Your Children Well. And Madeline says, look, we shouldn't do what our kid can already do for themselves or can almost do for themselves, or that is simply a function of our own ego. And I think to your listener's question, if your kid can almost do it, whatever it is, let them do it. That's the only way growth happens. And so, yes, we could probably do it more effectively, efficiently, cleanly, whatever the task is. But if they don't have that chance, we're depriving them of learning and growth. So, be there, be near, stand back, watch, whatever. But really remember, your job as a parent is to, give your kid that independence that they need in order to build the skills they're going to need to have, and you're going to really hope they have, by the time they're 20, 22, 25, so that they're not one of those fail-to-launch people. So I think those are the three keys. Don't do what they can do, can almost do, or what's really just a function of your own ego needs.
And the other thing I think parents would also need to know is that they have to allow their kid to be frustrated, to get frustrated, and to work it out on their own. So that means that parents are also going to have to deal with their own frustration of watching their kid be frustrated and calm themselves down or walk away so that they allow their child to go through these steps in order to gain mastery over whatever it is that they're doing.
Dr. Kim, that's exactly right. I cite another set of authors, two gentlemen who wrote a book called GIST, Michael Anderson and Tim Johansson out of Minneapolis. And in the book, they have a beautiful list in their book, and I've reprinted it with their permission in mind, called Mistakes and Curveballs You Must Let Your Kid Experience. These are things we don't want our kids to ever have to go through, not being invited to a birthday party, breaking something in a store, being told they can't get into a class or an opportunity they want, coming in last at something. But these are the very experiences childhood is meant to give children so that they get a little tougher, a little better at solving problems, a little better at coping with things, so that they become adults who can handle the much more difficult, emotional and physical, blows that'll come their way.
So how can we stop overhelping our kids when everyone else is doing it for their kid? Because this is a question I'm sure you get asked quite a bit. They feel that their kid won't have a chance if they're not the first one out there. And if they stop first, then doesn't that leave their child behind?
Well, this is a great example of the short-term win versus long-term cost. If you're going to stop doing your kids' homework, which I think you should stop doing the minute school starts, okay? Parents today are doing their kids' homework, and parents are arguing with teachers, and parents are saying, we are on the soccer team, and we're doing a science project, and we're applying to college. And the point is, no, you're not. That's your son's or daughter's experience. Here's the point. When we overhelp in those ways, when we stand in and do too much for our kids, we might achieve the short-term win, but the long-term cost is they will lack the ability to do for themselves, and they'll be bewildered in the world of college or the workplace, and they'll still expect you to help with their work at college or the workplace. You do not want that. So I'm interested in each one of us who knows and souls that this is true, to find the courage to say, you know what? I've been a fourth grader. I do not need to do my fourth grader's homework. I've done the science project. Now it's their turn. Teachers, schools are looking for parents, to be involved in the classroom in good ways, but to back off when it comes to homework. So this is where you have to, I encourage you to accept the short-term cost. Your kid might get a B or worse because you didn't help, but in the end, they've learned how to do for themselves. And when they do emerge out into adulthood, they've got what it takes instead of being hampered, hindered, by the crutch that you'll always be there for them.
And I think that kids know whether or not they've earned it. And the fact that if you let them earn that B and don't make them have to earn the A by you doing the work for them, that they start to believe in themselves. But if they know that they didn't earn that A, it's like this sense of feeling empty, and they know that it could all fall apart later on down the road.
Exactly. So we feel proud because the A's on the transcript, and they're psychologically crumbling inside.
Exactly. So let's talk about this whole college process. The questions that come out for you is that people are so stressed about just applying for college, what college that their kid needs to get into. Does it need to be the top school? And it just seems to get worse and worse. What would you tell them about applying to college and getting into college?
The first thing that I would say is U.S. News and World Report has duped us into thinking that there are only 20 colleges worth anyone's attention, and they're simply wrong. They're not experts at undergraduate education. What they are doing is selling a magazine and profiting off of our fear the way Sports Illustrated profits off whatever it is that draws us to the swimsuit edition. That's number one. Okay, just hold that in your head for a second. Okay, there are more schools than we've been taught to believe matter. Now, here's the reality. There are 2,800 accredited four-year colleges and universities in this country, and as with anything, I'd wager the top 5% are worth looking at. Okay? 140 schools, most of which have much, much healthier acceptance rates, meaning they accept 30%, 50%, 60% of those who apply. In other words, we don't have to aim only for those schools that are admitting 5, 7, 10, 12, 15, 20%. There are just plenty more schools, not to mention great community colleges. And, of course, there are people who never go to college at all and live very happy, successful, meaningful lives. So we have to widen our blinders about the type of colleges, the number of colleges that, quote-unquote, matter. Mm-hmm. And we have to be proud of our kids and kids in our community who don't attend those name-brand schools. You know, our kids hear us go, ooh, ah, when someone gets into a prestigious school, you know, and we go, oh, if we haven't heard of the school. Well, we often say, oh, when there's a really great college being talked about. Just because we haven't heard of it doesn't mean we should poo-poo it. A great undergraduate education is had where faculty are motivated to teach and mentor undergraduates. It's often the really small schools where that happens. So widen our blinders, take a deep breath. Our kids, you know, can go to a college where they'll be nurtured and supported, you know, and it doesn't have to be one of those most prestigious brand names by any means.
Julie, I feel that we could have you back and just talk about that aspect about colleges.
I'll come back, Dr. Kim.
Great. Okay. So really quick, just as a review, what are the top 3 things that people can do to raise an adult instead of an infant?
Well, humble yourself at the altar of childhood and accept the fact that it's not about you. You know, your kid is a human. You gave them life, but life deserves to be lived, and it's not well lived if another human, i.e. a parent, is providing too much protection, direction, or hand-holding. You know, in furtherance of that, you know, embrace the fact that childhood is meant to teach kids a set of skills and habits and mindsets, you know, from chores to work ethic. They need to learn skills. But just as important, they also need to play. One of the best things we can do for kids that'll help them not only in the here and now, but in terms of, you know, thriving in college and the workplace is to give them free, unstructured time. And that means an adult is not present telling them how to play and how to do it and what to do and how to work out their problems with their friends. Play is the work of childhood, and we need to be giving them a whole lot more of it.
Okay, I'm speaking to Julie Lett, and where can people reach you? And is there a place that they can even come to hear you talk?
Absolutely, Dr. Kim. Hey, I'll be coming down your way on August 30th. I'll be at this wonderful organization called Beit Shuva. It's an addiction treatment center, and boy, do they care about the ways in which overparenting leads to under-constructed adults and even addictive behaviors and worse. I'll be there on August 30th from 11 to 1. They're located in West LA. You can also find me on my website, howtoraiseanadult.com. You can find me on Twitter at raiseanadult or on Facebook, How to Raise an Adult.
Julie Lett, thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to having you back one day.
Thanks, Dr. Kim. I'll come back anytime.
All right. I'll be right back with some short comments after this break.
You are listening to Dr. Kim Taylor on KZSB AM 1290.
I'm so glad we had this conversation today. I think one of the most important aspects of parenting is to really teach and offer our kids the opportunity to develop the ability to tolerate frustration so that they can learn to develop the skills necessary to be successful in their own lives and reach their goals. So they really need to make good choices as well as bad ones to learn the difference and to learn to trust their own judgment. If parents do make all the choices, then kids don't get the chance to grow their self-confidence and self-esteem. So parents, breathe, take a deep breath, and let your kids discover their own potentials. And as my guest said, we want to be able to prepare them for life and not protect them from living their life. I would like to thank Julie Lett, and she'll be on my website where I'll post it. I will be back here next Thursday afternoon. And remember, nobody else has to change in order for you to feel better. I'm Dr. Kim. See you next week.